Welcome to the Infrastructure Podcast. My name is Anthony Oliver, and in today's podcast we'll be finding out just how much we still have to do as a nation and as a planet to hit our net zero carbon emissions targets and really start to reverse the clearly catastrophic impacts of a changing climate. My guest today is the Right Hon Chris Skidmore, former MP for Kingswood in South Gloucestershire, and the man who, as interim Minister of State for Energy and Clean Growth in 2019, signed into law the UK's legally binding target of hitting net zero emissions by 2050. He's held a number of government roles in his parliamentary career, notably Minister for Universities, Science, Research and Innovation, and then for Health under Boris Johnson, but returned to the backbenches in 2020. And it was from there that he authored the well-thumbed Mission Zero review of government's net zero strategy, a hard-hitting tome that, well, it's fair to say wasn't entirely well received by those in charge of the strategy. Chris resigned as an MP earlier this year in protest at the government's stance on new offshore petroleum licensing, and nowadays he's very busy championing the net zero cause and missing few opportunities to get that vital message across, and I think we'll hear a bit more about that work now. So Chris, welcome to the Infrastructure Podcast.
Thanks very much for having me.
So Chris, I set out your journey that you've been on over the last few years, and in particular your work to carry out the Mission Zero review of government's net zero strategy. In this, you described it as the growth opportunity for the 21st century. So set the scene for us. I mean, how do you think that this work has really influenced political opinion or policy?
So, as you very kindly mentioned, I signed net zero into law back in 2019. I didn't know then the sort of touch paper moment that would bring, almost a domino effect. The Glasgow Climate Pact at COP26 and subsequent international agreements have seen over 90% of global GDP signed up to a net zero target of some form. And the reality is now, the economic reality is that all investment decisions, countries are planning transitions that have net zero baked into their core. There's no future economy without a green economy. So when I had the chance to do the net zero review, I really wanted to make that narrative that net zero wasn't just a climate commitment, essential that is. This is an economic opportunity that we've got to seize with both hands before it's too late. Yeah. And the UK has been a climate leader in the past as a first G7 country to sign net zero into law. We've been able to halve our emissions on 1990 levels and at the same time grow our economy by 70%, demonstrating a model that means you can grow the economy and decarbonize at the same time. But other countries now have realized that they want to be part of this, and there's a net zero race taking place. Investment in green and clean technologies is happening at a pace that means that the UK has either got to step up or go home. And the reality is that, we shouldn't be investing in additional new fossil fuels at a time when we've got alternatives we should be investing in, because this can provide jobs, up to 430,000 new jobs by 2035. This can provide up to £1 trillion worth of inward investment. And I want to see that private investment, come to the UK and not go elsewhere.
Lots to talk about there, and your work does continue at pace, as a result of the Mission Zero initiative. But first, you recently launched the Better Earth initiative. It's an initiative, I think, from the report that I read, it will seek to help countries across the world deliver their decarbonisation plans to provide support and investment needed to make emissions reductions not just a hope, but a reality. So what is the initiative, and what do you think it will achieve?
So Better Earth is a new company that will seek to help countries with their own transitions. We know that all countries have signed up to providing new national determined contributions into COP, particularly in COP30 in Brazil. And this raised level ambition means that they'll set out their plans for 2030, but also they'll set out it sectorally for the first time what they need to do in industry, what they need to do in transport. Yeah. Now, many countries equally are seeking inward investment, and there are investors who want to invest in projects. Better Earth seeks to help align this, so to work with countries on their decarbonisation plans, to identify projects where we can decarbonise. Now, that might be taking existing assets and infrastructure and then looking at how you can actually reduce the emissions, either by, for instance, fuel switching or moving towards, projects like geothermal, how to help countries get the money in from private investors. And that's, I think, really important for 2030. So thinking in this immediate time, how can we encourage investment in clean and green technologies to help countries meet their decarbonisation plans.
So it's about prioritising, real projects, real reductions, and real in emissions by 2030. It's essentially a private company with professional experts, policy making, energy, infrastructure delivery, and green finance experts. I mean, essentially, it's a consultancy service, I imagine. Is there a particular gap in knowledge and expertise around net zero around the world then right now?
So while Better Earth, will seek to do advisory work and consultancy, I think that the distinguishing factor for me is you get companies like McKinsey or, Tony Blair Foundation, they just do the advisory work. What I'm hoping with Better Earth is to then say, right, these are the projects. We can then help deliver these projects with the engineering expertise on the ground as well. So we can help immediately move quite quickly to make this happen, and then also bringing in the finance. So actually, it's a new way of thinking, which is to say, how can we show you, like I did with the Net Zero Review, this is what needs to be done, identify the projects, actually bring in a team to be able to do the decarbonisation project, and then find the finance at the same time. So it's a wraparound service. And I think that's something that, countries do need that help. There's many countries that aren't in a place like the UK with the sort of policy expertise and the civil service. And so they do need assistance. And as far as I'm concerned, carbon dioxide knows no borders. We need all countries, working on where they can decarbonise to identify those challenges and to meet them. And so I've decided that I want to see 2030. We've talked about halving emissions globally by 2030. It's 69 months away. We need everyone as possible to get on with it. And I've spent 14 years doing policy. I've spent 14 years as a politician talking the talk. I now want
so this is now practical.
Exactly, yeah. And so for me, it's about I want a new challenge. I said in my resignation letter that I would commit the rest of my career, the rest of my journey in my life to net zero. And I can't see a better way of doing that apart from actually to get down into the reality of actually delivering the transition.
And of course, it is a global issue. It's a global issue. It's not just, it doesn't stop at the borders of the UK. But let's talk a bit more about the Mission Zero review. I mean, in that report, you said that, significant additional government action is required to ensure that the UK achieves net zero in the best way possible for the economy and the public. And it pointed out that, the UK is in a race to capture the economic benefits of net zero. I mean, how is the government getting on, in terms of really driving forward with those recommendations?
So what the Net Zero Review did is it sort of made 129 individual recommendations. Now, I always said, it's not just about creating a shopping list of what we need to do. And I took those recommendations. I said, out of the 129, this is what we need to do before 2025. So I said, these are the 25 recommendations before 2025. And then I also had 10-year missions. Now, this for me is the really important part, is that it's not just about the individual policies, it's about setting that long-term structural program.
Right, yeah.
So, the Inflation Reduction Act in the States, tax credits, the 45Q, the 45X is guaranteed to January 2031. In Germany, they've got a hydrogen plan that's guaranteed for the next 10 years, again into 2030. And what we need is something quite similar in the UK. And that's why these have these 10-year missions that I'm now following up on, trying to do, for buildings, for power, to show how we could deliver it. But actually, of the 129 recommendations, the government accepted about 100. They didn't always set the timescale. And we've seen, things like a net zero duty on Ofgem. We've seen the setting up of the solar task force. We've seen new plans to rebalance gas and electricity prices. It all come through from the review. So I was quite pleased with the government's initial response, of those on the individual recommendations. What's happened subsequently, however, is they haven't followed through with that long-term mission-based approach.
Yeah.
So, actually, it's been the Labour Party that set out a sort of green prosperity plan of a longer-term approach. And that's where we need to be, really, because if you're an investor, you need to know what the plan is. You need to know that this is you're going to stick to it. And there's been too many U-turns, too many chopping and changing for investors to think, actually, is my money going to be secure? And that's what we need to get back to.
Well, of course, as you say, 25 recommendations. We haven't got time to run through each one, but you make recommendations about accelerating renewables, ensuring solar and onshore wind are expanded, and around nuclear and CCS and hydrogen, of course. But of course, standing in the way of much of this ambition is planning. And planning remains a huge issue for the UK. I mean, how do you see that being streamlined to help?
So obviously, you've got two parts of sort of the planning system. One, you've got the sort of major projects, critical national infrastructure. we've got now, the Windsor Review came forwards making recommendations on how to reduce the waiting time for some of these grid connections and projects. And, we are going to have difficult conversations about what is essential infrastructure and just get on with it. And that's what the National Planning Policy Framework needs to do that. Then you've got the Town and Country Planning Act. And again, that's not fit for purpose. Large parts of it still date back to 1948. It's not, it needs to have net zero written into it. Net zero needs to be, a key distinguishing, feature of the planning, which will allow, therefore, people to stop putting in objections of a single person against a wind farm that would provide energy for thousands of people. And so, I would say we do need to rewrite the planning system, to make sure that it does have net zero running through it, that it does have, but at the same time, the other issue is funding local authority planning departments properly, because at the moment there are some local authorities that actually can get on with it and are doing quite well, but the problem is that we don't have the ability for being able to take these planning procedures forward because so many people are opposing things and they haven't got the resources to be able to deal with it.
So it's not about not having consultation. It's about having proper engagement that makes people understand what the issues are.
Yeah, and having then the sense of a community benefit on the back of showing that, yes, you need this energy project, but you will benefit from it. And many countries have written that in, and Scotland has guidance on if projects coming forward need to demonstrate community benefit, what that could look like. Both carrot and stick are needed. We need to push things forward, but also provide people with a sense of knowing what the future is going to be, and that future is going to provide them with opportunities to make their lives better.
And on the other side, of course, you also say that the benefits of investing in net zero today outweigh the costs. There are many, many schemes and opportunities, itching to get to financial close, but often lacking the policy certainty needed to bridge that gap between aspiration and reality. I mean, are there any shortcuts to changing that and to getting that policy really well defined? Well,
in the short of it, the big challenges around delivery across several government departments. And one of the recommendations that hasn't been taken up by the government, sadly, was to create a net zero delivery agency. Actually, Australia's just created one. And actually having an organisation that could then troubleshoot across all departments. Because at the moment, if you're looking to build a project, you've got to get, it might be community homes, local government, it might be DEFRA for the environmental positions, it might be DESNES. You've got to go to all around the shops, around the government, different departments. And that's the core challenge. And I always say, the bottleneck is at the top of the bottle. And the reality is, it still is that certain departments are not pulling their weight and are not realising the opportunity and are holding back other departments from getting on with things. So we need this sort of levelling force, I think, almost of an agency to be able to push things forward.
We do like a good silo in the UK when it comes to infrastructure or anything like that. So, I mean, but there is some real passion towards a net zero future in infrastructure. The built environment, after all, it does account for 70 or 80% of the emissions. I mean, what can infrastructure professionals really do to maybe take the public with them as well as the politicians on this journey?
So, that's a really good point around public engagement. We lack an engagement plan at the moment, at a national level. But I think for infrastructure developers, there are still policy things that you can do to cut things in different ways to try to create that narrative and a vision. So, not just identifying the carbon emission saving, but obviously the sort of savings overall that can be made. I mean, I'm really interested in buildings, both new and old, and obviously, commercial buildings, are a really interesting example around how do you sort of demonstrate with commercial property, the opportunity of decarbonising. If you can present it in a way that isn't just buying off a community with a new library or a new school or something, but at the same time in showing how the infrastructure is integral to the future of a community and what it's going to mean, whether that's reducing sort of transport journeys, whether that's planting new trees or so. All those things are really important, but they've got to be done at the start. I think that's the challenge also, with making sure infrastructure is not seen as an imposition. People are always worried about change. That's understandable. And people go through transitions all their lives. We change our cars, we change our TVs to smart TVs, we change our computers as they get uprated, we change our mobile phones. Changing our infrastructure is something that has to happen as things move on, and understanding that change is uncomfortable and working with change is what I would encourage all infrastructure developers to do, because it can be done well. It really can.
Well, I'm a trustee of the Built Environment Trust, a building centre down in Store Street in London, and we've got an exhibition, the retrofit, a commercial retrofit exhibition, which starts. It's going to go on for the next 3 months. Lots of things going on there, and loads of information about how the use of existing buildings can really change lives. I want to talk a bit more about retrofit and about the Mission Zero Coalition, which you chair. But first, talk a bit about you, Chris. Your background is it's thoroughly political. History at Oxford, working for politicians, think tanks. What turned your head towards the whole net zero agenda?
Well, actually, I was before I got involved in politics, I was actually a trained historian, so a bit of a failed academic. I mean, I wrote 4 history books and taught history at Bristol University. So I sort of gave that up to go into politics. And in a way, the sort of history has really informed my sort of framing of narratives, because I write for a living before I became a politician. What I found was actually when you looked at the net zero piece, everyone was doing their own thing, focusing on their sectors, convinced obviously what they're doing is the right thing to do. But that takes away that wider opportunity to weave a narrative, to put together a tapestry of showing how each sector interrelates to each other. So what I hope I did with the review was lean on my historical sort of knowledge, and also recognise that when a transition comes, that there are moments in history where there will be no turning back, and the historian in me looks at the transition now and says, well, this is happening, it's too late, you can't go back to the past. And learning the lessons from history is equally important. So learning the lessons from failed transitions in the past, our transition away from coal, when both sides didn't really do any justice to coal miners, when we decided we had it was uneconomic to stay on coal, and we left in communities high and dry. And that's my worry about oil and gas now. You can see the lessons of history repeating themselves. So I would say history is equally important as politics. I think that the challenge is that when it comes to net zero, how do we make sure it's not technocratic and that people can relate to it? That's my biggest fear, is that when you look at sort of infrastructure, when you look at the built environment, how can you communicate to people what is happening? And the reality of why we need to do things, and also not make mistakes, because we could talk about the built environment and then knock down buildings and put up new ones, but then people would then look at that and say, well, that's far more carbon dioxide being used than just keeping the building up. So there's an urge to maybe build nice shiny new things, making the case that actually it's better to repurpose, to retain where possible, and that organic element of understanding that our environment is something that we want to preserve the best of what we have, and obviously improve it while we can.
So it's interesting because you've got a huge passion for change and a huge passion for really learning. I do say that if you want to know about the future, know about your history, but having stood down as an MP, is there a kind of a feeling within yourself that maybe you'd have more chance to influence the debate from within Parliament rather than from outside it?
No, I did think a lot about this. It wasn't like I suddenly decided I'll wake up and I'll resign. I'd agonised for months, if not a year, about sort of the journey I needed to take, and I knew that once I'd gone on this journey about committing absolutely to net zero, that this could potentially be a logical conclusion of where I might have to end up. Because ultimately, as I said, I care more now about conserving the planet than the Conservative Party. And the reality was that I was becoming increasingly distant. And I think there's a time in life where you've got to say, can I remain in an organisation and try and change it from within? Or do I need to leave, knowing that if I don't leave, my own integrity will be challenged and people will not accept what I'm trying to say. And I sort of thought actually it got to that point where my own integrity of being able to argue the case while remaining in a party that was continuing to push for new additional oil and gas licenses meant that I had to leave. Now, I could have stayed as an independent, you're right. I could have, sat on the benches as one person. But I'd been there, I'd voted against my party about 10 times. We've been the only Conservative in with the Labour Party and all the opposition. No one cared. No one noticed at all. No one reported on it. No podcasts went, Skidmore's done X, Y, Z. It has zero impact. So I sort of felt there was a moment in time where I thought that I had to had to sacrifice my own sort of political career and all that goes with it. It's lovely to be an MP. Don't get me wrong, it's a fantastic job. I've loved doing it, and I miss, and who doesn't? I mean, we've seen some people like Lee Anderson decide to quit the Tories and join Reform. Now, I just think that is totally unacceptable because your electorate voted you in as a certain political party. They voted me as a Conservative. So I handed the mandate back to them to choose, knowing that I was independent. So I felt, and 11 years ago, I wrote legislation saying if you defect or if you go independent, you should cause a by-election.
Yeah. Would you say politicians really understand the issues surrounding climate change? All the implications of their decisions, many of which are perhaps driven by short-term electoral agendas?
I mean, I'm very keen, and then the Net Zero Review, Emission Zero was keen to show is that what we've got to do is to actually get these decision-making processes out of politicians' hands as best we can, both nationally and internationally. Yeah. Now, we can do that through, obviously, regulation, legislation, like we talked about planning, putting the systems in place so that it is not about the politics. The more we can push this into the cross-party arena where institutions, systems can just get on with it, local authorities, regional areas, the better. People, don't trust central government, and equally we can't trust central government not to do a U-turn on the back of electoral politics. The more we can do to ensure that politicians aren't simply on a pedestal pontificating about how they're going to reduce emissions and then depart the stage 2 years later, or when they get kicked out, the better. Because ultimately, this is about setting the long-term frameworks to deliver in the long term, and that can only happen through business and industry. And why we need new net zero markets. And once the markets move, nothing you can do about it. That's why I'm still a centre-right politician. The markets will decide.
Yeah, it's a cross industry. It spans borders. What have you done at home then? What have you done yourself to reduce your own carbon footprint? What
have I done at home? Well, I've begun sort of a process of getting my home sort of retrofitted with new windows and insulation. Haven't got a heat pump yet, though. I will say to people that the challenge is this is a transition. So a bit like with your car, you should be moving to your next car to be an EV. But if you've got a petrol car at the moment, as I have, it's a 10-year-old car, my next car will be an EV. But the reality is that no one's forcing people to change. We've just got to, make sure when we move to the next stage, we modernise, we renovate. And so, I think the challenge is how do you make sure that people like myself and everyone, just get on with it and, don't think, I've got to be, this is a personal thing you've got to do. Because I've never been like that to anyone. I've never said, right, you've got to be X, Y, Z. The Net Zero Review was all around how do you create the systems-based approach for people to change. If your boiler breaks down, if you need a new boiler, you shouldn't get another boiler. It should be a heat pump. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the same for your car. Once your car has reached its last legs, you should be going to an EV.
Well, that perhaps leads us nicely to the Mission Zero Coalition, which you chair. I understand this is about bringing together key stakeholders within the Mission Zero networks based on the 10 priorities that you discussed from the review: solar, nuclear, circular economy, waste, etc. I mean, clearly there are many other groups working on each of these areas. I'm thinking of the Nuclear Industry Association, Hydrogen UK, etc., etc. Why is this alliance different?
So it was very specific in terms of we set it up to pursue the policy agenda in the Net Zero Review. So there was 10-year missions. There was meant to be a report for each mission showing actually in more detail how do you deliver the mission. The Net Zero Review was 350 pages long, but it still was quite sort of top level. And I felt actually I wanted to sort of give more detail. So there was that there. Then I found actually one of the great opportunities I had with the Net Zero Review, I spoke to over 1,000 businesses, held 52 evidence roundtables, was that cross-cutting element. So, I mean, you mentioned a lot of the trade organisations, but they often, only speak to themselves as the nuclear industry or as the, growing hydrogen industry. We need them to speak across each other as well. And that's what I've been trying to do, with the Mission Zero Coalition, is we've got a new report that will come out at London Climate Action Week. I'm co-chairing that with Dan McGrail, the CEO of Renewable UK. But that will include nuclear, it will include solar, it will include wind, it will include grid and infrastructure. And so actually for the first time, I've got people in the nuclear industry talking to people in the solar industry about how are they going to work alongside each other, not competitively, but how do they create that sort of sense of collaboration for the future? And I think that's been really rewarding. So I think that would be one distinct area, is actually it sort of looks to bring everyone together. And at the same time, I'm a big believer that we've got to just keep pushing on this agenda. So I welcome more think tanks and other organisations, because the other side, will constantly, it's a grind. You just got to keep on pushing forward this agenda with as much information as possible. And what I try to do with the reports is also, yes, we set out the challenge, but it's not always about, this is put in the too difficult box. It's trying to say this is the economic opportunity and to restate the case.
Because clearly there is some low-hanging fruit, but there's also some really hard to decarbonise areas. I spoke to Faustine de la Salle recently on the podcast, who highlighted the scale of the challenge in these hard to decarbonise industries. The Mission Possible partnerships that she runs is really trying to get focus on those difficult areas, rather than perhaps maybe some of the easier sectors. I mean, will focus on the hard bits really accelerate us faster towards net zero?
Yeah, and I think the difference between easy and hard is therefore where the role of government needs to come, is intervention. Because if it's easy, the government shouldn't necessarily be getting involved. If we can deliver this through markets and private investment, then we don't. Right. That's not why they should be prioritising what needs to happen. So I see issues that are hard around things like energy intensive industries, heavy industry, as being a massive opportunity if we get the right framework.
So that aluminium, steel, cement and concrete, chemicals,
Yeah, so one of the statistics in the Net Zero Review that I always quote is that 8% of all businesses in the UK are responsible for 80% of our gas use. Huge. I mean, so it's a proper Perot principle here. If we can, that's where I think if we have a mission focus on industrial decarbonisation, it's not necessarily through hydrogen immediately, but electrification. There's lots we can do now. Digitisation. Sort of moving towards combined heat and power. That's where we don't have a strategy in the UK from the government. We've got these clusters, which are great, but lots of dispersed sites across the Midlands. They've got no plan of how they're going to decarbonise. They're having to pay a tax on the emissions trading scheme, and that's going to go up. Their credits are going to go down. The emissions, so actually the compliance market is going to expand. They need help.
Yeah.
And so I would say that the role of government should be hyper focused on trying to target areas where we can see the greatest shift in emissions reduction in the near time, which would be heavy industry.
But meanwhile, there's lots to do that maybe should be driven by the private sector. And your latest Mission Zero Coalition report is called Building the Future: Lessons for a Buildings Breakthrough. It focuses on retrofitting the existing building stock, but also it talks about ensuring that new buildings are fit for purpose. I mean, it's all doable, Chris. And you read the report and you think it's all obvious, but is it failing because of a lack of ambition in the UK, or what's stopping it?
I think there is a lack of ambition. We do need leadership from the top. And we've seen, in the past, when you do have that central leadership, everyone can get behind a mission. And so, we don't really have that sense about what the outcome. We know where we want to be in terms of reduce our emissions. We know where we want to be in terms of saying, well, we need to produce, sort of 70 gigawatts of solar by 2035. But how do we weave this into a place which says, we're going to reduce bills, we're going to improve air quality? There's sort of, someone needs to step up, and ideally, it would be the Prime Minister and the government to basically say this is what we want to achieve. I mean, I think more generally, people are crying out for leadership on where is Britain going, where's the future of Britain. That's what the Ronald Reagan approach of saying if your life is better in 5 years' time, vote for me again. We've lost that. Yeah. Everything is too much about politicians saying what they're against and not what they're for. And so that positive vision of hope is really needed.
But there is I suppose a temptation by the infrastructure profession, perhaps, and maybe by politicians, to seek technical solutions rather than simple cultural change. The switch to heat pumps, to hydrogen and complex heat exchangers, rather than simply installing better insulation and draft proofing. I mean, do you see that as being a problem that we have in this country?
Yeah, I think that it is very difficult with infrastructure and buildings to try to get across the cut through, because everyone could be focusing on the latest PASC measure and the technical details of what's needed in the future home standard, and then you lose the room, because obviously that's for the professionals are focusing on that. And obviously there are some debates which are unresolved around the future use of hydrogen for heating. I know where we need to go. I don't think we should be using hydrogen for heating. It should be electrification. But equally, there's challenges around with heat pumps. Should you do full fabric first versus sort of, and so some of those challenges make it difficult to have clarity and a middle ground to move forwards. One of the reasons why, for instance, we said we should bring the boiler mandate forward, not backwards. Obviously, the government's gone backwards. Is the longer you push it down the tracks, the more it gives flexibility for the sector to sort of like juggle different solutions. Whereas if you brought it forward, you're like, right, guys, crack on with it. And we saw that with the 2030 target for new electric vehicle cars. It moved so far down the tracks that actually companies said, well, yeah, okay, you've moved it back to 2035, but we're still carrying on with 2030 because we've made our plans. And I think that's what we need.
Well, building on that leadership theme, just to finish off, we've got a general election coming along. I mean, are there dividing lines? The Conservatives have arguably degraded the Green agenda. Labour's deprioritised it. I mean, who do people who care about this agenda, this climate change agenda, who do they vote for?
Well, I think there are some clear dividing lines now, obviously, around oil and gas and the future of fossil fuels. There's clear dividing lines around the pace of the transition, whether it's push for 2030, whether you push 2035. There's obviously other key sort of dividing lines on culture war now, which is also one of the reasons why I left the Conservative Party. Was it was trying to politicise a consensus that we previously had ever since the Climate Change Act, when the Conservative Party in opposition backed the Labour Party. So I personally would like to see a return to that sort of consensus, and ideally not have this being fought tooth and nail over at the general election. I think people should look to the party that's going to set out a long-term, calm, stable transition. But equally, we've got local elections on the 2nd of May. Mayoralties, really important for delivering on net zero. I would like to see mayors have greater net zero powers, and I know they would too. So it's how do we rebuild that coalition and that consensus. I'll work with anyone. I will have do joint events with mayors, with politicians that support an agenda that I think is the future.
So who will you be campaigning for? Will you be on the doorsteps?
I'll be campaigning for net zero. I don't know whether I'll be on the doorsteps as such, but sort of because I'm not standing myself, and having had 14 years of knocking on doors, trust me, it's not always the most pleasant experience. I will be focusing on events. I'm about to launch an event with a campaign with UK 100 ahead of the local elections. Mm-hmm. So watch out for that. I think the role I can play is to try and support those who are standing for highlighting their record or their sort of promises and hopes for the future, and encouraging people to sign up to agendas that will promote what needs to happen in the next 5 years.
Yeah. So finally, what can listeners do to help you on your mission? You've got lots of things, lots of balls in the air, lots of plates spinning. What can they do to help?
Well, I guess it's sort of it depends what your listeners are doing. I guess if they are a company, organisation that has got sort of a project where you're seeking finance or wants to get something off the ground. If anything I can do to help, do get in contact with me on LinkedIn or something. If there's something you say, well, actually, I've got this project, it needs a bit of help to get across the line. I'm here to be a champion of things that are going to deliver for the future. So that's sort of hugely helpful. Equally, if there's any sort of projects which you're looking to open or launch and want me to come along, let me know, because as I said, I'm trying to get around the country, I'm here to try to use whatever platform I have to help others deliver on the ground.
Well, I'll make sure I get you down to the building centre at some point to have a look at the retrofit exhibition that's going on down there. Chris, a pleasure to talk to you today. Really, really important and really, really challenging issues. So thanks very much for joining me today to explain on the Infrastructure Podcast.
Thanks very much.
Great, thanks Chris. That's all we've got time for today, but we will have more from the Infrastructure Podcast in the pipeline and more guests to talk to as we continue to probe the big issues faced across the sector. If you haven't done so already, do check out the Infrastructure Podcast website. That's www.infrastructure-podcast.com, where you'll find background information to some of the issues discussed today and all the latest podcasts to listen to and to share with your colleagues. So thanks for joining us. Thanks again to Chris, and I look forward to seeing you again very soon.